Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the early medieval period in our continuing study of a history of Christianity. Charlemagne was crowned the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 Christmas, 800 AD, and this marks a bit of a turning point. Around the same time, the Pope produces something that was entitled the Donation of Constantine. He'll be bringing this out from time to time, claiming that Constantine had written it. By all accounts, it's now considered to have been a forgery produced around the time instead of Charlemagne. But supposedly, it gives the Pope power and authority, political power and authority over the west half of the Roman Empire and gives him certain fiefs and domains. What's happening here is the Pope is trying to elevate his own power. It's a power play. And his own authority over the surrounding kings and over the emperor of that Holy Roman Empire. On our timeline, we have around this time, 700 actually, the Venerable Bede. He's a English historian, produces a translation of portions of the Bible as well. We have the Battle of Tours, of which we have spoken, halting the Muslim advance 100 miles south of Paris. We have the first iconoclasm, and we're going to talk about icons in a bit. This is the first time when icons are taken and destroyed. That's what an iconoclasm is. The clasm part is destruction of something. And so it's a destruction of icons, and we'll talk about what icons are, these religious symbols and pictures. Next, we have the Second Council of Nicaea, just before 800. And of course, we've already said Charlemagne is crowned in the year 800. And around this time, we have, and for the next 100 years, we're going to have a series of Viking raids. These Norsemen coming from the Scandinavian countries, coming down and taking easy pickings, taking their longboats and sailing up the rivers so that living inland, maybe 10, 50, 100 miles inland, but if you're alongside a river, that's no defense. And then finally, we'll see Cyril and Methodius, two missionaries sent to the Slavs. And as a result of this, as they begin to make converts, the Slavs have no written language. And so Cyril is going to make do. He's going to take their language, try to use Greek and Roman letters, but there's some sounds that the Slavs make that just won't fit into that. I know a bit of that from experience. And so he has to add a few letters, and the result is what we call today the Cyrillic alphabet. Now, I mentioned that we have some councils. We've already looked at the first four. I refer to them all as Trinitarian, but really the first two are focused on the Trinity, and the Council of Ephesus, Chalcedon, and the next two councils at Constantinople are all further defining who is Jesus and how do we understand him. But it's the last one that I want to talk about, and that's the Second Council at Nicaea, and this will talk about icons. Now, what is an icon? It is a picture, but it's more than just a picture. It is a representation. You say, well, aren't all pictures representations? Yes, but it takes on spiritual significance as eventually the Christians in the East, in particular, will come to what they call venerate the icons. Now, that sounds to an outsider like me, to a Westerner like me, that sounds like they are worshiping the icon, and that's uncomfortably close to idolatry. Remember how there was a law in the Old Testament: you shall not make any graven images or bow down to them. And venerating, kissing the icon, it's a little close to idol worship, at least in my eyes and in the eyes of the West. Our friends in the East would say, no, we're not worshiping, we're just venerating, we're giving respect to that which is represented by the icon. And again, I want to say, well, isn't that what idolatry is? They're giving respect to, sometimes to wrong gods, but even sometimes, for example, take the example in the Old Testament, where a golden calf was taken, either by Aaron or at a much later date, in the days of Jeroboam, where golden calves were set up within Israel as as items of worship, and they were quick to say, we're not worshiping a pagan god, we're worshiping the Lord, but we're using this golden calf as a way to sort of direct our thoughts. Well, that's idolatry. And here again, it's smacked of idolatry. And so there are going to be those who say, we need to destroy the icons, and they will be the iconoclasts, the icon destroyers. And this is going to be a big issue to the church. I mentioned the Vikings, these Norse raiders from the north, the Northmen, and they come down in their longboats, and this gives them access all across, not just the Atlantic part of Europe. They are pagans, have no respect for Christianity, at least not at this early day. That's going to change as we go forward. And they are going to land in places, for example, they'll land in northern France, and they'll give these Northmen, or Normans, as they come to be called, are actually going to give name to the place. We refer to that as the Normandy Peninsula, even today, where many of them will settle. They will also follow the rivers of Russia up and settle. Some of them will settle there and become the Rus people, or amalgamate with them. They will go through the Straits of Gibraltar all the way into the Mediterranean. They'll invade Sicily. They'll attack Constantinople in 865, again in 907, both times failing to capture the city, but at least making the attempt. And the emperor will be so impressed with them, he will hire them as his own personal bodyguards. You can't beat us, but why don't you join us, is the idea here. You were here to loot. Well, why don't you work for some money, and we'll give it to you. We'll pay you to be on our side. And that works out nicely. English missionaries will try to make inroads, and it will be slow going. But those missionaries will be patient. And over a process of a long time, it won't happen in a year or a decade, but over the long haul, eventually Christianity is going to come to those Baltic countries. Siegfried, an English Benedictine monk who dies in 1045, will be the missionary to the Vikings, missionary specifically to Sweden. And this will culminate when he baptizes King Olaf of Sweden, making Sweden a Christian country. Now remember, it's going to take a while for everybody else to catch up with the king. The king is baptized, and everybody says, okay, we'll follow suit, but who's this Jesus again? And it's going to take them some time, but it will take root. Now, Europe during this time has a hierarchical system with the Pope, at least in his view, on top. If the king was drawing up this chart, he might put the Pope a bit off to the side. After all, you have the king, and then there's the ultimate authority, God. So they would argue about exactly what this chart looks like. But you have the Pope, and then you have the king, and then he has various nobles who are in his service, and those nobles will have answering to them. Knights, those are warriors who have their own horse and weaponry, and then there will be other vassals. They might be ready to help in battle, but they won't have their own horse. So a lower class of warrior, perhaps. Below them, notice we have both the merchants and the craftsmen. So the merchants are buying and selling, perhaps not linked to just one city. They will have contacts throughout a number of cities, whereas the craftsmen are usually going to be confined into one place. And then below them at the bottom, notice on the one side we have the peasants, and then on the other side we have the serfs. You say, what's the difference between a peasant and a serf? The serf is tied to the land. He is not technically a slave because he can't be bought or sold, but where the land goes, he goes, which means he's not going anywhere. The peasants very oftentimes were close to being the same, but they at least had the freedom to get up and go, even if there was nowhere to go to. Now, the Viking threat is what solidifies this. There was a need for local protection, and the king can't be everywhere, and so that's why he has to have the nobles, and the nobles have to have the knights and the vassals. And this system will eventually give rise to states and nations in Europe. Next, we want to talk about the Cluny Reform. Here the issue was primogeniture, and I think we've mentioned this in a previous lecture, where when a king is going to leave an inheritance, if he leaves it to all of his sons, his kingdom is going to diminish. If he's got four sons, it's going to get it'll be divided by four, and that kingdom will be very tiny. And if his sons do the same thing, it will get tinier still and tinier still until nobody has a kingdom. Everyone just has a little closet to themselves. And so the firstborn would get everything. And that's what the word primogeniture means. It's where the firstborn inherits and everyone else gets, well, hand-me-downs, well, what's left. And this means that one of the jobs that a second or third-born son could get might be a bishop or an abbey or a nice, comfortable, well, maybe eventually even something like pope. Um, and if he's not suited for it, well, that's just too bad. He'll be paid for the position. There was the buying and selling of church offices, a practice known as simony, and in response to that, because the purity level of the monasteries was going down, the Abbey of Cluny was founded in France in 910. And here the idea was we're going to get away from that primogeniture. There will be, the local king or nobility will not be allowed to place their sons into this abbey. Instead, it will be under the oversight of the Pope in Rome. Now, the Pope's not going to come and check into things there in Cluny. That's far removed from him. But by having it under his oversight, they don't have, when it comes time for a new father of the abbey to be brought forth, a new abbot, as they would call it. Well, they can appeal to Rome. They can say, well, no, you can't just put your son here. It has to go through the Pope. And so it will give them a level of independence. Now, the land here will be farmed by serfs. Remember, under the previous orders, it had been where the monks themselves would do manual labor, and then would do prayer, and they would do other things. Here, the land is farmed by serfs to set the monks free so that they can have as their primary work of service liturgy and prayer and praise, and they can focus exclusively on spiritual things. Now, a couple of hundred years later, we're going to see another reform needed, because once you've reformed, after a while, things start to get lax again. This time it will be the Cistercian Order. Begins in the French village of Cîteaux with the group of Benedictine monks, 1098. This is a reform on the Cluny movement, and it's a return to the manual labor and the self-sufficiency of the previous era. Remember, Cluny had said that the monks aren't going to do manual labor, they're just going to focus on spiritual things. But they were getting a little soft and a little bit lazy and a little bit, whatever. And so it was decided to go back to the rule of St. Benedict. Remember, he said that Benedict had said everybody works. And so they're going to go back and everybody's going to work again. The Trappists, by the time we get to the 7th century, there'll be a 17th century reform of the Cistercians. So each time you need, after a while, the order starts to get a bit lax and time for a new reform. And so we see this as an ongoing issue. Now, it's Bernard of Clairvaux from this Cistercian family of monks. He founds an abbey in France named Clairvaux. That's how we get the word Clairvaux. Like Clare Valley is the idea behind it. And he tried to bring reconciliation between two competing popes. We're going to look at the popes in a future lecture and see how we end up not with just one pope, but with two. Well, which one's the real pope? And they're each excommunicating the other and each denying the other. And he said, that's not working. And so he tries to see if he can find a way to bring peace. And before we're done there, we're going to actually have quite a few things happen. We'll eventually end up with not two, but three popes, three for the price of one, before it all gets ironed out. Now, one of his disciples, Eugenius III, becomes pope, and Bernard wrote for him what's called the Book of Considerations. It's a book giving advice on how to be a leader. Calvin would later quote from Bernard's comments regarding justification by faith and about imputed righteousness, say he had the Reformation long before we did, hundreds of years before we did. He was already speaking about these truths. And so, quoting Calvin here, thus Augustine says, the righteousness of the saints in this world consists more in the forgiveness of sins than the perfection of virtue. And he cites where Augustine said that. To this corresponds the well-known sentiment of Bernard, not to sin is the righteousness of God, but the righteousness of man is the indulgence of God. Now, you have to stop and think about that. And he goes on, he previously asserts that Christ is our righteousness in absolution, and therefore that those only are just who have obtained pardon through mercy. Well, that's Reformation theology. And Bernard of Clairvaux had come up with it hundreds of years before the Reformation. Another quote from Bernard, he says, one cannot now say the priest is as the people, for the truth is that the people are not so bad as the priest. A reform movement was needed, and he's speaking about when the Cistercians come about at this time. A reform movement was needed because the quality of holiness among the priests and the leaders has sunk. What Bernard says, the priests are worse than the people. Even the people aren't that bad. He goes on, and here he's speaking about one of the contestants for the papacy. He says, that beast of the apocalypse, to whom is given a mouth speaking blasphemies, and to make war with the saints, is sitting on the throne of Peter like a lion ready for his prey. It's going to be interesting because the reformers will say something similar, not just about one particular pope, but about the papacy in general. Next, we want to speak about the investiture controversy. The investiture controversy asks the question, who ordains bishops, priests, leaders in the church, and ultimately popes? And here the struggle will be, again, you have kings that would like to be able to have that power. And so we have an example of this power struggle that comes up when Henry III of Germany becomes the Holy Roman Emperor in the year 1046. And this is the time where I already said we're going to come back and look at this, where there are three competing popes, and Henry deposes them all. He says, okay, we'll just wipe the slate clean. We'll start over. He says that none are fit for the papacy. He might have been actually right there. And Clement II from Germany was made pope. And everybody thought, well, he's pretty good. Yeah, he evidently was better than the three that had been deposed. But he was elderly, and he only lived for 1 year, and then he died. Well, Henry III continues to appoint successive popes, and you eventually get to Leo IX. He's going to be pope from 1049 to 1052. You say, why so little? Remember, they would be appointing older men, so they might not live all that long if you're already aged. And it's Leo IX who mandates clerical celibacy. Now, it had already become sort of a long-standing practice. We'd had something even from the Council of Nicaea that if a priest wasn't already married, then he shouldn't be getting married once he was a priest. But this goes above and beyond that. From now on, those who are clerics of any sort in the church are not going to be able to be married. That's quite in contrast to what we see in the New Testament. The New Testament actually gives regulations about elders and deacons, and one of the regulations was that he should be the husband of one wife. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that he has to be married, but at least it's saying that's a possibility that he might be married. So this actually flew in the face of Scripture. He also forbade simony. Simony was the practice of selling church offices. The term itself actually comes from Acts chapter 8, where there is this Simon of Samaria who tries to purchase the Holy Spirit from Simon Peter. And Peter, he basically calls him Satan. He says, what do you think you're doing? And so that was wrong, but it had become such a regular practice that the forbidding of such was necessary. Now we come out with that donation of Constantine, possibly penned at an earlier age, but now it's made public. And see, I have the authority to do this because I have the authority from Constantine himself. Way back then, he gave authority to the popes to run things. And we also are going to have, but we're going to come back and talk about this as well, where Constantinople, both the patriarch and the entire church and everybody who belongs to the church is going to be excommunicated by the Pope in Rome. He's going to say that whole branch of Christianity is all going to go to hell. By the way, they will return the favor eventually. Now, the question here comes up about custom versus canon law. You see, a lot of these things that were taking place, you had the idea that, well, we've always done that way before, or are we operating according to some legalized law that's been written down for the church? We're talking about church law here. Now, Henry III now is succeeded, by his 7-year-old son, Henry IV. And because he's only 7 years old, he's not going to make too much waves about the church, and the papal reforms are allowed to move forward. At the Synod of 1059, it's decided that the Pope will now be nominated by cardinals. That's to try to exclude the idea of this king or that king, or even the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, from nominating the Pope. So they're taking advantage of Henry IV. Next, we have Gregory the Seventh, and it's going to be Gregory and Henry, so we can sort of remember those names. Gregory the Seventh becomes Pope in 1073, and he forbids lay investiture, not just of popes, but of bishops and any church offices. From now on, it will only be the Pope who will make church offices. And he calls for celibacy among the clergy. Well, that had been called for earlier, but the word had gone out, but it had not necessarily been obeyed. Gregory the Seventh is trying to make that stick, and now a confrontation is going to take place between Henry and Gregory, between the emperor and the Pope, and it begins when Henry IV appoints a bishop. Remember, they had forbid lay investiture, and he's doing it. And so Gregory the Seventh deposes Henry. Here is the Pope saying, look, it was a Pope that put the crown on your head. It can be a Pope that takes the crown off your head. Henry has just been deposed. Now, that's no big deal because the Pope doesn't have an army behind it, but that hit Henry at a particularly bad time. And what took place is all of the princes, all of those nobles that were under the emperor, were told by the Pope, you don't have to obey him. And all of a sudden, they've just been told, gee, we don't have to pay our taxes. We've got an excuse. We can blame it all on the Pope. And so they all say, we'd like to pay our taxes. We'd like to support you. But the Pope told us not to. We have to obey the Pope. And so, we're just going to withhold our taxes, which, they have a financial interest in doing that. And so Henry puts on the robes of a penitent, of one who is repenting. And he goes that January. This is in northern Italy, and it gets rather cold in northern Italy. And he goes barefoot to Canossa, the castle there where the Pope is residing, and stands out there as a penitent asking for forgiveness, standing in the snow for 3 days. Until finally, of course, the Pope is in the forgiving business, so finally the Pope will forgive him and restore him to his office. And Henry will go back and sort of have it out with those princes. They will pay up their taxes. And at a later date, Henry will be back to chase the Pope out of Rome. So the conflict is going to continue.